Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. It is a pleasure to have so many of you with us for today's live panel discussion brought to you by the VLGA and LGPRo on the role of the Mayor. It's more than just a title. Really looking forward to unpacking this with our panel very, very shortly. Before we commence, I would like to, in the spirit of reconciliation and on behalf of VLGA and LGPRo, acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. I'll introduce the members of our panel to you in just a moment. Before I do that, I'd like to call on Kathryn, Arndt, the CEO of the VLGA, to do a welcome and make a few introductory comments. Kathryn, good afternoon. Nice to see you.
Good afternoon, Chris. Thank you for that introduction. Well, on behalf of the VLGA and LGPRo, I would welcome you all to today's discussion on the role of the Mayor as we find ourselves waiting with anticipation for the results of the local government elections, which have, of course, taken place in unprecedented times. The VLGA is delighted to be collaborating again with LGPRo to bring this program to you, and we look forward to many more such collaborations, and I'd like to acknowledge my colleague Chris Eddy. As the only independent governance organisation in Victoria supporting councils and councillors in good governance, the VLGA provides opportunity for councillor networking, professional development and information exchange, and we actively and regularly engage with key policymakers and broader stakeholders to inform, influence and lead the conversations that determine the priorities for the local government sector in Victoria. As hopefully many of you are aware, all councillors and staff of a VLGA member council can access the organisation's programs and services, and we welcome a diverse range of participants in the audience today and certainly acknowledge all of you and those candidates in the room and your commitment and potential contribution to the local government sector should you be elected. Thank you to our panellists today, and I'll let Chris introduce them to you shortly. We are, of course, disappointed that Judy Verlin was unable to meet us today due to ill health. Nothing too serious, but we do wish her a very speedy recovery. Today's discussion may take us many places. From the VLGA's perspective, we hope that the conversation may lead us to examine the role of the Mayor as a position of leadership based on capability that fulfills the legislated responsibilities associated with the position, as opposed to a political appointment. The position of Mayor is more than just a figurehead. This role must lead the councillor group and set clear expectations of the standards of conduct required. The role must also mediate when these standards of conduct are not met. Judy had intended to speak with us today about perceived conflicts and how the Mayor, and in fact any councillor, must be mindful of perceived conflicts that may be associated with them. For example, you may well have made some public comments if you were a candidate in these elections about matters that you might be opposed of or willing to advocate for before council if elected. Of course, you must bear in mind that if you are elected, you must leave that position at the door when you enter the council chamber, as there is an expectation that you will enter the council chamber with an open mind and therefore be able to enter into deliberations having read all of the information in front of you. Anyway, I'm sure we'll go into this in a lot more detail, and I'm really looking forward to today's discussion, and I'll hand back now to my colleague, Chris Eddy. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathryn. And on behalf of LGPRo, as the interim CEO at this point in time, it is a pleasure to once again be partnering with you at the VLGA on this session today, because obviously professionals working in the sector also have a very keen interest in ensuring that they do what they can to support councils, councillors and mayors. In the next few weeks, as you're aware, councillors will be sworn in for a new 4-year term in most municipalities across Victoria, not all. And one of the very first tasks for these councillors will be to choose a mayor, a team captain, a first among equals, if you like, the person who will set the leadership standard for their council and community for at least the next 12 months. So one of the aims of our session today is to prompt some thought and discussion on the importance of the process of appointing a mayor, what consideration should go into making this vital decision for a council, for the council organisation and for the local community? How does the new Local Government Act and the changes to the role of the mayor impact on this process? What are the skills and capabilities that are required to be effective in the role? And should councillors have regard to this in making their decision on who to support for the position of mayor? As Kathryn said, perhaps it shouldn't just be a political decision. To help us answer these and other related questions, we're thrilled to have a highly experienced and qualified panel with us today. And as Kathryn noted, Judy Verlian unfortunately was unable to join us. But we do have Noelene Duff, who is the Chair of Administrators at the City of Casey and previously was the CEO at the City of Whitehorse for a significant period of time. Great to have you with us, Noelene.
Good morning.
Peter Stephenson is with us. Peter is a former councillor and mayor at the City of Darebin and has been a Municipal Monitor on a number of occasions and is looking forward to sharing his observations and learnings from those two roles with us in relation to today's topic. Good afternoon, Peter.
Good afternoon, Chris and everybody.
Nice to have you with us. And we're thrilled to have Melissa Scadden from Justicia Lawyers. As the name implies, Melissa's a lawyer, but also spends a bit of time around that conflict resolution space as an arbiter, and is going to share with us some observations on the impact of the new Local Government Act on those processes. Melissa, good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Great to be here. Thanks, Chris.
Great to have you all with us. I'm going to start with you, Noelene, if I may, to get from you some perspective on this time in the electoral cycle. Now, I'm going to leave it up to you whether you want to approach this as a chair of administrators or using your CEO experience. What do you think is the most important thing off the bat that people should be aware of at this time of selecting a mayor at the start of a council cycle?
Thanks, Chris. I'll probably approach it from the CEO role, but I think one of the most important things is the relationship building. And so this is, it's a sort of a strange period because it's the beginning of a term. We've been in COVID. It's quite an artificial environment. So I think that sets perhaps a little bit of a different tone for the induction process for councillors and mayor. But for me, I think the mayor can set a very particular tone, and that can be good and it can be bad as well. But I guess my key message to those that are in the process of selecting a mayor is to be very deliberate about it, to think about it very carefully. And so the CEO, I think, is an enabler and a facilitator in that process. So for my part, the important precursor, if you like, of conditions in the selection of the mayor, given the circumstances we're in at a new term of council, is the whole induction process for the whole council. So it's really ensuring clarity around what the role of the council is, what the role of the councillors are individually, what the role of the mayor is, and where the organisation fits into that. I think that is really critical. And within that, the clarity of the role of the mayor. And I know Melissa will talk about some of the changes in the 2020 Act that really sit with, you know, the role of the mayor and how that changes. But I think the CEO can ensure that the councillors in this circumstance get to know each other, because there's going to be potentially new councillors that have never been in that role before, and councillors that are experienced. Some councils might have completely new group of people. So I think that induction process is really important, and the CEO setting that up and making sure that there's a good environment for people to get to know each other, and to opportunities for people to get to know each other, to understand the organisation, to understand the role of the CEO. So the CEO has to play a very active role in that relationship building and enabling those councillors to build that, start to get to know each other as well. I think that the concept of a position description for a mayor is really helpful. I think that's a good entree, and I think that that can set out both the particular obligations, as in the statutory obligations, but it can also set out within the beginnings of the code of conduct, and councillors going into the council will be required to adhere to the existing code of conduct and then develop a new code of conduct within 4 months. But I think the position description can lend from that code of conduct and start to create a picture of what the role of the mayor should be. When we get into a mayor has been elected or is in the process of being elected, I think the other thing is for those people that are considering being a mayor or wanting to be a mayor, to really think about what their skills are, to think about what they can bring to the role, what their and honestly what their deficits are, what are the things they need to learn and understand. And when I was preparing for today, I was thinking, how many mayors did I work with at Whitehorse? And I think there were 13 or 14 in the time I was at Whitehorse. And they all came from different perspectives, different skill sets. I had people that had never chaired a meeting in their life. Yeah. So, you know, to people that were very experienced. So the CEO has to be agile and has to be capable of moving with those different needs and requirements as well. But I think going into the role of mayor, people need to appraise themselves pretty honestly. And I think the CEO has a role in helping them to do that, in thinking through, talking to them one-on-one if they have aspirations to be mayor before the election. But once the election process begins, again, I think the CEO and the organisation need to set up the circumstances, give the opportunities for people to display their wares, to talk about what they can offer, to ask each other questions, and to, in an ideal world, have, you know, a pretty open discussion. That doesn't always work like that. That's the ideal. But I think it's incumbent on the CEO to enable and facilitate those processes to occur. And I think once you're into the sort of the meeting, I think the opportunity for potential candidates to speak to their nomination is really important. And I've sat through a number of those over the years, and I think, you know, they're pivotal moments for people listening to, you know, what that candidate has to offer. Often people haven't absolutely decided until they walk into that chamber. And I think there's a bit of a sense that it's all a bit of a done deal. Well, I've sat through many a not done deal, and you know, out of the hat and all of those wonderful experiences that I know many people in the meeting today will have had. But I think once the mayor's elected, again, you know, it's really going through that goal setting, understanding what the skills of the mayor are, helping the CEO, helping them to do that, enabling them, giving them access to professional development, possibly a mentor or a coach if that's what's required, going through the paces of whatever their needs are, whether it's chairing a meeting, you know, it just depends what it is. And I think then, very importantly, beginning at the commencement of the term, is setting the code of conduct. So I think the mayor can play a very pivotal role in setting up those behaviours and expectations, because that's where the failings of how councillors and teams of councillors can work together most effectively is around that behaviour.
Thanks, Noelene. You've raised a number of points there that I want to come back to and hopefully unpack a bit during the course of the session, not the least of which the idea of position descriptions, and also this notion of, you know, experienced councillors versus brand new councillors vis-a-vis the role of mayor. I want to come to, actually, before I do this, can I just remind the audience that as you think of questions, we'd love you to type them into the chat window. We will collect those questions for open Q&A in about 10 or 15 minutes from now, and then we'll do our best to get through as many of them as possible. So please pop your questions into the chat. Peter Stephenson, I'd like to come to you next as a former councillor and mayor. Some of those points that Noelene was making around expectations and standards of behaviour. In your experience, does the CEO have a role in helping councillors set those standards, and should they? Absolutely,
Chris. But let me just say first of all, Noelene demonstrated why she was such a well-respected CEO across Victoria, and she made a number of points that have made me think a lot harder about what I'm going to say today. Well, I think there clearly is a role from CEOs, and in my time on council, and it's going back a bit now, but I had some wonderful CEOs who really were able to coach without telling, able to show without showing off, able to lead us without trying to be the captain. So I was fortunate, and my colleagues were fortunate to have such CEOs in the time, in my time on council. But the mayor has to be the one who demonstrates how it's going to work. And I say this, and when we had a chat the other day in preparation for this session, I said that you learn from your mistakes probably more from your successes. And in my time on council, it was, well, we were all members of the one political party, and if we thought that that was a good thing, then on reflection it wasn't, because the Labor Party can eat its young at times, and there's many who will understand what I'm saying there. And it wasn't about the discussion we're having here. It wasn't about getting the best person. It wasn't about getting someone who's inclusive or has an attitude of bringing people together, or has emotional intelligence. And I've got to say, I didn't know what that term meant a decade ago, let alone whether I held any of it. Did we think about PDs? No. It was numbers. It was purely numbers, and I'm sure it was numbers across many other councils. And Noelene has mentioned drawing out of a hat. Now, some of the best councils have come from those experiences, but I'm not sure. It must have taken a lot of work to get those working, because there's got to be bitterness. There's got to be some angst when those sort of things occur. Now, maybe because I'm getting older and I'm close to retirement, well, in fact, I'm retiring again in a week. Maybe I'm living in a bit of a fool's paradise, but I see, and again, learning from less than great experiences, I see that there really is an opportunity, whether it's to have a PD or not, but to really be critical in that decision making of who's going to be mayor. And as both yourself and Noelene have said, Chris, think about, are you ready? And if you're not, just wait and get it. Watch how it unfolds. Not wait your turn, but wait until you have those skills in your pack. I'll say one other thing. It's not about time served either. And I've worked not just in the two occasions I was a monitor or municipal inspector. I've worked with probably 10 councils across Victoria where there's been some issues. And some of the time there's been an issue is where the councillors have given the role to a person based on time served rather than a capacity to bring people together and to focus on what's good for the community. Often it's been, well, on those occasions, it was opening the door to disaster. Let me say that. So if it's about the numbers, no good. If it's about my way or the highway, it's no good. I'd like to think a mayor today would be amplifying the voices of the submerged, of those who don't really shout it out, as well as giving the loud shouters a go as well. But really it's about attitude, aptitude, inclusiveness, and you can get the skills if you've got those things.
But a question without notice, you've sort of raised it there. I think we've all probably seen situations where councillors have put their hand up for mayor and they've said, I'm going to be the true captain, the first among equals, I'm going to lead for all of us and take all your views into account, etc. Halfway through the mayoral term, the rumblings start, well, they're just like the last mayor, they're all about their own profile, etc. How can councillors get a feel for that capability, I guess, or the capacity of a particular councillor to lead them equally and fairly?
That is a good question. Yeah, how can you demonstrate that in a PD? How can you demonstrate it in a conversation? I don't know, but I think getting up in front of people and staking a claim and telling people why in front of the community at a statutory meeting. I mean, if you want to be held, you're going to be held to account, one would expect, one way or another. But I think you've got to judge someone on the engagements when it doesn't matter as much as the critical issues when it does matter. So if you think that the person isn't someone that you want to deal with most of the time, then don't believe them telling you they're going to change when it really matters.
Yeah. Great. Thank you, Peter. We'll let you catch your breath, and I want to bring Melissa Scadden into the conversation. And another reminder, I can see the audience is already using the chat window. Keep those questions coming. I can see we're not going to have any trouble giving lots of questions to the panellists for thought today. Melissa, thank you. From Justicial Lawyers, and of course you have a different perspective again, particularly, can I say, when things perhaps don't go well. And we'll come to that. But firstly, the new Local Government Act, it does have some changes that relate to the role of the mayor. What sorts of things do you think first-time councillors particularly need to be aware of? Well, all councillors for that matter, in terms of these changes.
Thanks, Chris. So Local Government Act 2020, I think it's safe to say that 2020 is going to be notable for many reasons for us. And one of them, which is perhaps lower down the list than it normally would be, is the fact that the Local Government Act did have a really significant overhaul. And there's a staged implementation plan, but there's certainly been some significant changes that councillors, officers alike need to make sure that they're across. The new Act is certainly intended to be less prescriptive. It's meant to be a principles-based piece of legislation, and one of the key areas of reform the Act is intended to address is improving councillor conduct. So we've got these defined standards of behaviour and some stronger mechanisms to address poor conduct. And the mayor has a really important role to play in that. Now, I don't have enough time today to go through all the provisions that relate to the mayor's and the councillor's conduct, so I'd certainly encourage you to have a look at sections 18 and 19, which actually set out the role and the powers of mayors, as these have increased under the new Act. Notably, in addition to duties such as chairing meetings and being a spokesperson for council, the new Act does require a mayor to promote behaviour among councillors that meets the standards of conduct set out in the Councillor Code of Conduct, to lead engagement with the community and the development of the council plan, and then report back at least annually on the implementation of that plan, and also required to take a leadership role with respect to regular review of performance of the CEO. So in addition to those roles, the Act also specifies some powers that the mayor has, and they include being able to appoint a councillor to be a chair of a delegated committee, and also direct a councillor to leave a council meeting if the behaviour of that councillor is preventing the council from conducting its business, and that will be subject to governance rules as well. The Act allows a council to establish an office of deputy mayor and allows that deputy mayor to exercise the role and powers of the mayor if the mayor is unable to for various reasons. So the obligations and powers are more extensive than what we saw under the previous Act, and we can expect to see a greater scrutiny of mayors because of this. So it is more important than ever that the right person is elected to that position of mayor. Now, as an employment lawyer, I'm frequently called to advise on management issues. And often these stem from a really common misconception that someone who is good at their job will be good at managing others or leading others in doing their job. But that actually requires two really different skill sets. So for those in the audience who are going to find themselves in a position of determining who will be mayor, I really encourage you to think about whether the candidate has the necessary skill set to be a leader, not just a councillor. And this is obviously reflecting some of the comments that my panellists have already made. So also, as I mentioned, under the new Act, the Mayor is required to promote behaviour among councillors that meet these standards of conduct. And these are going to be set out in your code of conduct, which, as Noelene touched on, must be reviewed and adopted within 4 months of a general election. I'm sure we'll touch on this later, but the code of conduct is a really great opportunity to actually get together as a group from an outset and talk about some of the standards of behaviour that are expected, because you do have an opportunity to add matters in there outside the prescribed standards. And I'm sure we'll touch on that later as well. But the government recently introduced some regulations, so integrity regulations, and these set out the prescribed standards of conduct that must be included in your code of conduct. And they include standards in relation to the treatment of others, performance of the role of councillor, compliance with good governance measures, and a requirement that the councillor doesn't discredit or mislead the council or public. The Act also includes provisions about dispute resolution, how to escalate allegations of misconduct, and talks through about how it's essentially goes through a process of internal resolution through independent arbitration, and then escalated through your councillor conduct panel and your VCAP proceedings. But under the Act, this new Act, there is a greater capacity to dismiss individual councillors, as well as to call on a minister to investigate poor behaviour of councillors. So, as Chris mentioned, much of my experience is in this space. I have acted as arbiter of disputes under codes of conduct. It was under the previous Act, so it was a slightly different process, but nonetheless, I've certainly worked with groups of councillors that were experiencing a high degree of dysfunction, not to mention a really high level of stress and distress in many circumstances. And the complaints that came to me were often that they were seemingly about a specific incident. So a statement at a council meeting, a social media post, a statement made to the media. But it quickly became apparent that the reason these individuals were going through this process was because they'd hit a breakdown in their professional working relationship. And I so frequently heard this phrase, oh, it's been going on for so long now, but this last incident, it's just the last straw. And I have got no option but to go through this process. And because of the broad nature of the standards of conduct, we're talking about concepts like objectivity, treating people with respect and fairness. So if you have a conflict with someone, chances are you're going to be thinking that there's a breach of these standards of conduct, and you're going to feel you can mount a complaint or an allegation of misconduct. But basically what we've had is we've had some conflict. And, you know, let's be honest, it's fairly inevitable in this environment, there's going to be conflict. But the problem is it hadn't been managed effectively, or in some circumstances even at all. So there was a complete breakdown of trust, there was a loss of goodwill, a loss of respect. And in those circumstances, the arbitration process, it was no longer about dispute resolution. And if anything, it caused greater division, particularly where other councillors are called to be witnesses. So it's really important that councillors as a group are equipped to manage conflict effectively. And the councillors that I've seen do this have an effective leader. Okay, they have someone who will foster these strong relationships and they will build trust. They can guide the group to collectively agree some ground rules from the outset, and Noelene touched on this, about how you deal with each other, how are we going to deal with conflict. And also really need a leader who will have these difficult conversations, will have them with empathy, and will address and effectively work through that conflict. And that really is, I think, key in terms of that role of mayor.
One thing that has arisen in what you were just talking about was this notion of councillors behaving badly and how to pull that up. Andrew's asking what if the councillors believe it's the mayor who is the one that's behaving badly. What sort of options are available to them in that case?
Certainly under the provisions of the Act, the ability to call for an independent arbiter to come in and deal with allegations of misconduct, that complaint can be raised by a councillor, an individual councillor, or a group of councillors. So irrespective of whether it's a mayor or if it's a councillor, if there is a concern that there is some misconduct, they can certainly go through that process, and similarly can escalate it if they consider it serious misconduct. I think that the message that I really like to try and get across, though, is that try and use these tools as a last resort, and instead go back and try and have a framework for addressing conflict from the outset, early on. And the mayor, although the mayor plays a really pivotal role in helping to guide and create that framework, the mayor is also required to comply with that framework as well.
Yeah. Kathryn, we might move into questions from the audience now, because I know there's a string of them starting to build up.
Thanks, Chris, for that. And you jumped in there. I was going to ask Melissa that exact same question, but you picked it up. Thanks for that. There's been a few questions around what's the timeline in which that statutory meeting needs to take place? Why the urgency? Does it have to happen straight away? Is there an opportunity for the councillors to get to know each other a little better before they make that important decision of who to elect as mayor? I just wondered if the panel had any views on that. So,
and the point probably is, and Noelene, I'll come to you in a sec, I think I saw your hand go up, that some councils have already set their, I don't think statutory meetings are the right term anymore, but we still call it that, have set those meetings for the purpose of electing the mayor already before they even know who their councillors are. So yeah, why the rush? Is it necessary? Noelene, your thoughts?
Well, firstly, and Melissa's the legal expert, but I think the mayor has to be elected within a month. Is that correct? Yeah.
Yeah.
So there is a statutory driver for that, and I think most councils tend to set their first council meeting within that time frame. Obviously, in the election of the mayor process, the CEO would chair that meeting, but it's not possible for the CEO to chair other meetings of the council. So the council must have a chair, and that needs to be the mayor. So there is a statutory driver within that, and I think that's important. It's important for that leadership role to be established quickly. But as I said, that the getting to know you process, it is a bit of a speed dating exercise. There's no doubt about that. And, that is hard for people that perhaps are in a room where they really don't know others. And that's likely. There will be in most councils at least a few people that will not know each other. That's for certain.
Dare I suggest, with COVID conditions in place, it's going to be even harder for that getting to know you process to happen, because there'll probably be a lot less face-to-face interaction, correct?
Yeah, that's right. And I think, there's the individual relationship building, and then, as Peter said, there's the political overlay that sort of sits about, numbers, people's turn, all of those sorts of things. But I think individuals can make a difference to that discussion within a group of councillors as well. And it's incumbent on people to, put forward their ambitions, their interests, their capabilities, but they can make a difference to that conversation within that group as to, what the rules of engagement should be for the election of the mayor.
Melissa, so as we've pointed out, the mayor needs to be elected within a month. Obviously, there's some imperative to get the business of the council moving again. So the administration obviously wants to have those meetings as soon as they practically can. But there's nothing to suggest it has to happen within 3 days either, is there? So what's so there's no minimum requirement other than that month?
No, certainly not. So in terms of what the Act says, it just says a mayor is to be elected no later than a month after a general election, and there needs to be determination as to whether or not there's going to be that election for a 1 or 2 year term. So certainly there's no requirement that it must be immediately, and it's interesting to see the different approaches of some desperate to just get it elected and get on with it. But certainly I think that there's a lot of merit in pausing to go through what effectively is a job interview process. You really need to think about what are your key selection criteria here? Well, how are we going to measure someone against this position description? So take the time that you're allowed under the Act.
That brings us back to the issue. Sorry, Kathryn, 1 second. I just want to pick up the point of the position description, which I think Noelene first raised. Now, I can remember, and I know we've got Daryl in the audience from Greater Shepparton. When I was at Greater Shepparton 20 years ago, there was a position description for the mayor. What's your sense of how many councils do have a position description for the role of mayor and take it that seriously? Melissa, have you come across it?
To be honest, I haven't. I really haven't come across anyone with a position description. I certainly haven't seen one myself. So it is interesting that that approach hasn't been taken, and certainly I hope that coming out of the conversations today we'll see more of it. But I think I saw in some of the chats that there are certainly some of them out there, and there's a suggestion that they might be able to share some of those resources.
Kathryn, back to you.
Thanks for that, Chris. Yes, I did see that Greater Shepparton had a position description that they might be able to share with people if you're interested. Just going back to the role of CEO, Kelvin Spiller had made a comment in the chat and he said that he'd be happy to talk a little bit more to that. So over to you, Kelvin.
Thanks very much, Kathryn, and good afternoon, everyone. Peter mentioned before the reference to emotional and social intelligence skills, and that's right, 20 years ago we didn't know too much about that. But emotional and social intelligence, from my observation, is something that is sort of outside any written PD, outside any legislation as such, outside any KPIs, because you can still meet, whether you be a mayor or a CEO, all those other requirements and still not have a level of a satisfactory level of either emotional or social intelligence skills. So often I've seen a CEO's level of emotional and social intelligence skills not really being mature enough to enable them to be successful in the role that they have. So from my observation over the years, I've seen a number of CEOs, in fact, I'd say many CEOs, whose level of emotional and social intelligence skills not really matching the complex job that they are required to do. And that doesn't mean to say it has to be a large municipality. It can be a small municipality, because you need to be able to create rapport, build relationships, pick up nuances when you come into a room. You need to be able to have empathy, listen carefully to what people say, and also to be able to communicate strategically. So, it does depend certainly on the level of emotional and social intelligence skills that the mayor and councillors have, but equally on the level that a CEO has. And you only have to look at the Spence Consulting report that's just come out for the last 4 years, where more than 50% of CEOs that were in the sector now aren't. And this is a trend that's happening in all states around Australia. So lots of pressure, lots of issues.
Yes, good point, Kelvin. Only 27, I think it is, of the 79 that were there at the start of the last term are still in their roles. And here we start the clock ticking again. But that's probably a topic for another day. I noticed the product placement in the background there too. Very clever, Kelvin. Thank you.
It always sits there for my coaching sessions.
Melissa or Peter, just on that issue of the emotional or social intelligence, if a council has a position description for a mayor, I'm betting that one's probably not in there. And certainly if you look at the Act, it talks about the responsibility to uphold standards of behaviour and promote those standards of behaviour. Surely that emotional and social intelligence skill is a prerequisite for doing a task like that effectively.
Absolutely, Chris. And whilst we probably wouldn't have named it in my time, really, if you didn't have it, or somebody didn't have it, you'd know it. And it's not just for the interaction with colleague councillors. I've seen some interactions in the community where social and or emotional intelligence could have saved a particular mayor from a lot of embarrassment, but equally with interactions with officers, because I don't want to go too far from the point, but one of the things that's stuck in my mind over the years is this thought that a number of councillors have had that I've met, that it's an us and them between the mayor and the councillors, that the CEO is trying to run the show when it's, and not letting the councillors in. And if you start from that point, well, I don't think you're showing any intelligence, let alone social or emotional. And it can be the start of a nightmare to come. And we've seen some, and Calvin's laughing because he knows. He's seen it. He's seen where councils have ended that way. And I'll just leave that point there.
Fair enough. Melissa?
Yeah, look, it is really interesting, I think, the whole idea of essentially it being a prerequisite and do you put it on the position description or not. Certainly when you're looking at measurables and quantifiables, when you're looking at almost interviewing someone for a role, you want to try and remove a bit of that subjective element as much as possible. But ultimately, absolutely, it's so imperative that they have these skills. And it does come back to, I think, we're really starting to reflect generally about the skills of a leader. And certainly, I think recently there's been more international coverage talking about how at the moment, the most important skills of a leader are empathy, compassion, and vulnerability. So we have to really have a bit of a mental shift. We're not talking about someone who is the most charismatic. We're not talking, as much as they're required to be a spokesperson of council, we're not talking about someone who appears to have all the right relationships with the right people or is very eloquent and articulate at driving their point home. Ultimately, it is about that relationship building, because you need to build those relationships amongst your councillors, and as we've touched on, also with the council staff and the CEO as well. That is so important. And so you have to look beyond, I think, some of those perhaps more stereotypical ideas of who makes a great leader, and really thinking about what are those characteristics that actually do demonstrate that they have that that social and that emotional intelligence. And if certainly some guidance, I think, for your council group before they elect a mayor as to how these qualities might actually present themselves, I think it'd be really useful.
Kathryn, I'm sure we've got a big list of questions building, so we need to get our skates on and see if we can deal with a few of those.
Thanks, Chris. And look, might I also bring people's attention to the Local Government Inspectorate's report that they did on the employment cycle of the CEO. Of course, that's well worth reading because it does highlight some complexities that, of course, we haven't got time to go into today in regard to that employment relationship of the CEO. Matt Driscoll has asked a question about, you know, if we have experienced councillors and then new councillors, would it not be better to elect the mayor from the experienced councillors? And I know, Peter, you spoke a little bit about this in your opening. Of course, we're in a situation where we actually have a new Local Government Act, so even the experienced councillors would not have fulfilled the role of mayor under this new piece of legislation. And we've talked a lot about this being a position that is one of leadership and capability. So I'm interested in the panel's views on that. I'm
really, really strong on this, just from what I've seen in the places where it's perhaps been broken. On occasion, it's been time served, and so it's your turn, or you've been here longest, and so you can be the mayor, but it hasn't necessarily brought all the other things that are required, and that the skills that Noelene and Melissa have talked about. And in some occasions, it's been a disaster. In my experience on Darebin Council, we actually went for, because, well, when I got elected, it was coming back from being sacked. The council was sacked in 96 or 97, and it was a fresh election with nine new people. Well, not all 9 new people, but 9 people, and I think 4 of those were returned. And we went for somebody who had experience, because they also engendered the kind of or showed the skills that would engender our trust. And that person really set us off took us forward in a positive way. But on other occasions, I think the best people have been the ones that have been passed by. And I think, forget about how long you've been there. In one example, the person had been a council for more than a dozen years and had not been mayor. Well, there's a reason for that. But they ended up mayor, and it ended up in disaster. So I think, forget about time served. it's got to be based on the skills that have been talked about today. And I did see Ruth talk about needing political skills, of course, and there are a number of other skills, but many of the concrete skills can be learned, and particularly if you have a good CEO who can help with setting up the structures and can coach. And I was fortunate to, as I said, to have been in the council that had that. But you can't just create or get the soft skills through a book or through a conversation. You need to learn and practice those.
Peter, I'd suggest too that it's a bit close-minded to think that that skill, that experience that is relevant to the role could only be developed from having been a councillor. Surely there are other activities, other fields of experience, and I think someone in the chats mentioned boards and community work, etc., that could stand someone in good stead to fill that role as well. Absolutely,
and a number of people in various councils. If we looked across the state, there'd be many candidates for election who are serving their communities in a variety of roles, and really, if they're on a board, on a committee of management, then they're following a rule book. It's just when they come to council, it's a different rule book. So if you can chair a meeting, you can chair a meeting. But if you can't chair a meeting today, you can be taught to chair a meeting. But if you want to chair it effectively, I think, and for the best outcomes, you want to have some of those soft skills.
Kathryn, what's our next one?
Well, there's a couple I'll roll into one comment, and that is, it looks in the chat that there are a few councils who are having their mayoral election on the 16th of November. So that's actually 3 days after the official election declaration. Now, of course, I'm not sure what the options are available for those councillors or candidates who are then ultimately elected to get a good sense of who their colleagues will be sitting around the table. But I suppose they could speak to their council about that. Because of course 3 days isn't a particularly long time in which to get to know those people around the table. Marcus had a couple of comments, and I'm not sure if he wanted to talk to those. Marcus?
I guess the question for me in thinking about who we might elect, and this is all pretty presumptuous because none of us are being it, do we actually define the outcomes we want from the role of mayor? So if we don't really know our councillors all that well, but we understand the kind of outcomes we want to achieve from that position, that can then guide you to think about, okay, based on what we know, who do we think's best placed? There's this challenge of selecting the good narrators. I think Melissa made that point too. There's, the big media people, they present really delightfully well and it's just disastrous. I don't think it should automatically be someone who speaks well to a group. And if it's a case of, okay, councillors, you've got 30 seconds to do your pitch, that'd be a horrendous way to select a mayor, I think.
Thoughts on that from anyone on the panel? I can see nodding in agreement. Noelene?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think that is an important point, but I think Melissa really nailed it in what she said, that and Peter in his comments about the dimension of the role. And I think that the CEO's role is to make sure that the mayor and councillors do understand, the fundamentals of the legislation, et cetera, but at the same time, the mayor's role is not leading the organisation. And I think, there's often expectations that people come in that they're going to be managing the organisation, and that's not the role of the mayor. So being clear about the strategic direction and the policy direction that the council want to take is really fundamental. And I think, the pitch around that is, as Marcus is saying, is equally as important as their capability to lead. And those soft skills, are so vital in conflict resolution and all of those issues that mayors are going to have a new responsibility for in this term.
Yeah. Melissa?
Yeah, so I agree. I think that it's quite interesting talking about this whole idea of defining it from an outcomes-based perspective. And I think it's certainly good to look at it from that perspective, and as part of that dialogue, it's that educative process of this is what the mayor's role is, and certainly looking at that challenge of getting together a group of people who sometimes come from completely ideologically opposed backgrounds, and looking at working together collectively to achieve what you're setting out in that council plan. So certainly I think really defining that, yeah, as much as the mayor is in the Act said to be the spokesperson of council, what is it that you are really wanting the mayor to achieve in terms of leading and guiding that group forward? So I think those conversations, if you can sit down and start to have them, and you can still have them in 3 days. Yes, it will need pre-planning, absolutely, and arranging schedules. Fortunately, we've got the wonders of Zoom, so we can get everybody together, quite easily. You need to start having those conversations and really teasing out, this is what we expect the mayor the role we expect them to play, and then get the candidates to speak to that, to talk to how they consider they will be able to do that role. And really listen to the language that they're using, and listen to those conversations about collaboration, building relationships, fostering those relationships, and put to them, how will you deal with conflict? When conflict arises, what would you propose to do? And really see how they would approach that. And that's where you start to see the clues of that emotional intelligence.
Well, listen, Noelene reminded us that the role of the mayor is not operational. Some of the comments in the chat are suggesting perhaps a little bit of confusion about whether the new Act is taking the role. Can we just clear that up? I know the mayor's got a role now to liaise with the CEO on the development of the agenda, etc., and there's reporting requirements and deliberative engagement, etc. But it's not really more operational than it has been as a result of this legislation, is it?
No, I don't think so. And I can certainly see why there is a little bit of a confusion, because that is always a point of dispute as to the involvement of the mayor and indeed councillors in that operational side of things. But if you look at it, no, as much as they are required to have that relationship and the liaison with the CEO, and that is incredibly important, it is still quite specific about what they're required to do. So when we're talking about providing advice to the CEO, it is about just when the CEO is setting the agenda for council meetings. And so it is quite specific. And again, if you have a look at that section 18 of the Act, it does set out what that sort of level of, even if that's slight moving towards the operational side of things. But I think that's possibly overstated some of that commentary to a certain extent.
Yes. So that would be my reading too. Thanks, Melissa. Kathryn?
There's an interesting question here from Chris that asks, what weight should be placed upon the percentage of the vote achieved in the selection of the mayor, that is reflecting the wish of the people? And I'm assuming that Chris is referring to the vote as achieved during the election process. Am I right, Chris? I just wondered what the panel's thoughts were on that.
Peter, is that something councillors take into account, the strength of the individual councillor's primary vote, for example?
Chris and Kathryn and everybody, I've heard some people put it forward, but I'm not sure that too many people take too much notice of it. I don't think it makes any difference at all, because to be honest, there are several different elections in the one election, and you might be up against 10 candidates and in another ward there might be 2 candidates. I just with all respect to the person that raised the question, no, I don't think it should be considered at all.
And I guess it, again, raises that understanding of both the voters and even potentially candidates about what their role is once they are elected. And of course, my view on this and the VLGA's would be that regardless of how many votes you may have achieved in an election process, once you are elected, you are an equal amongst equals, and you are all tasked with the same responsibilities, and that is to make decisions at a governance level on behalf of all stakeholders of your municipality. So I certainly agree with Peter's comments then. Interesting question from Steve about whether or not mayors have a vote or a casting vote.
And the answer is yes, of course. But for the technical answer, Melissa?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So mayors have a vote, and certainly I need to pull up the provisions in front of the Act, but casting vote as necessary as well.
Yeah, and that's a standard that's been in place for some time, so we don't believe that's changed.
No.
Just going back to that issue of putting weight on the primary vote of the councillor, even if you argue that that was relevant first time around, it's not going to have much relevance 3 years into a 4-year term, for example, if you're still, using that to help determine who your mayor's going to be. And I'll just make the point, unless you're in the city of Melbourne, you don't actually get to have a say in who's going to be mayor. What else have we got, Kathryn?
There's a question from Joe about whether during the statutory meeting there is a requirement for the CEO to be present for the whole meeting.
That's an interesting one. Melissa, any thoughts on that?
That one I will need to delve into the Act myself. There might be one of the other panellists who can give an immediate answer. Otherwise, if you hold fire, and I will find that out for you.
My first thought is that in the CEO's position description or contract of employment, there's probably a requirement for the CEO to be present at council meetings or a delegate of the CEO, but I've never seen anything that suggests that the CEO has to be present for the entire meeting. And, if that was the case, if the CEO had to leave during the meeting, come back and be recorded in the minutes, you would think. But that's just the lay, I'm not a lawyer, view. Noelene, have you ever come across that?
No, but I think it's an interesting point. If the councillors don't want the CEO at a meeting, that probably speaks to another dimension of reflection on performance or, behaviour or whatever. But I think, just on that point, the fundamental issue is the relationship that's built between the CEO and the mayor and the CEO and the councillors more broadly. And so that relationship needs to be built. What does that mean? That needs to be built on, good communication, open feedback, being able to, as Peter has said, to play the role of coach when that's needed, or to, tap on the shoulder around a political issue. That's a hotspot issue that perhaps is not being attended to. Whatever it might be, the relationship part is just so primary and fundamental. And if the CEO doesn't have a good relationship with the councillors, then maybe they don't want them at the meetings.
Yes. Okay. I did notice a question a while back there in the chat around the issue of, and now I've lost my train of thought, if the mayor is expected to sit for a total of 4 years. But Melissa, perhaps just a 101 on what the Act says about 1 and 2 year terms.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah.
Let me bring that one up, and I can get it straight from the horse's mouth, so to speak. So effectively, we're looking at section 25 and 26 of the Act, and it says that before the election of the mayor, so in the exemption essentially is Greater Geelong City Council, which must be elected for a 2-year term. But basically, before the election of the mayor, council must determine by resolution whether the mayor is to be elected for a 1-year or a 2-year term. And then it goes on to have some of the provisions as to when the election of the mayor must be held, depending on what's been decided in terms of 1 or 2 years.
So there was quite a bit of debate when the Act was being, or the bill was being prepared around that 2-year provision, for example. And in effect, nothing's really changed, has it? Because if you get appointed for 2 years, you could resign after 1 and they'd have to appoint another mayor, couldn't they?
Yeah, absolutely.
Kathryn, back to our pool of questions.
Yes, I'm just wading through them. They're coming in thick and fast. A few, I guess, are just probably for noting. Simon has asked a question. I'm not sure if Simon is a candidate or a community member, but is saying that the community is very confused about the powers of councillors and mayors, and what, in particular, their powers over operational matters. And indeed, many candidates don't appear to be aware of their limited powers. This, I think, Simon's point lends itself to how the community can be made more aware of what are the responsibilities of councillors, and also the operational matters that they don't get involved in. I think that's a really good point that you raised, Simon, and certainly from the VLGA's perspective, we've tried to do a lot of commentary to increase the understanding of voters and the community in the process leading up to these local government elections. But I would just recommend to all community members that you find out more about the process of local government, and how and why you're voting in the elections.
Kathryn, that might lead us into the question that I notice our friend Lenny has asked in the chat. And I wonder whether Lenny might like to come off mute and ask his question. It goes to councillors' involvement in management of offices.
Yeah, I was just reflecting on a couple of experiences over my period as CEO where individual councillors have had concerns about officers' behaviour and have been quite vigilant in raising those issues directly with the CEO. And I can see the benefits of that. But in the context of the new Act, I'm interested in the panel's perspective on where the Mayor might fit in that dynamic.
Thanks, Lenny. Who'd like to have a go at that one?
Well, I don't think the Mayor does fit. I mean, the value of councillor feedback to the CEO about the performance of officers, I think, is fine. And then it's really for the CEO to do the work on that issue, if it is an issue, to take it on board. But I think once you've got CEOs starting to discuss the detailed performance of individual officers within the council, I think the blurriness of the roles and responsibilities is not good, is not a good message. And to that point around the confusion about the community, I think that there are councillors that can aid and abet that confusion in the way that they interact with the community as well. And I've seen councillors operate most effectively in saying, thank you for your inquiry, I'll make sure that's actioned and it's passed on. And if you've got good customer service capability within the council, then those issues will be responded to, and it's incumbent on the CEO to make sure that they are. So I think, once councillors are elected and they really do understand that, they're not able to intervene in a parking fine or whatever it might be, then they send that message to the community as well. And that's part of the educative process that Kathryn has mentioned as well.
I agree wholeheartedly with what Noelene said. I'd say this though, it's important not to have a filter on giving direct feedback to the CEO. So I'm agreeing essentially that a councillor should give that feedback to the CEO, and it should be direct, because the minute you start putting filters on feedback. Now, it might be about something completely innocent. It might be positive feedback, but there'll be the times that feedback might have to go somewhere dark and murky. And if it's been filtered, then that can create further issues. But absolutely agree with everything else that Noelene has said, and I try to avoid all of those circumstances of trying to create confusion or aiding any of that confusion in the community. Alas, it's still happening.
Doesn't always work. Thanks, Peter. Melissa?
And I think it's interesting as well, when you're talking about the situation with actual council staff, it's important to remember that that's an employment situation, and so it is dealt with quite separately. And so absolutely it is important that if there are any concerns about the conduct of council staff, that they can be raised, obviously respectfully, by the Mayor perhaps, and to the CEO. But then that does need to be dealt with in accordance with the employment requirements, basically in accordance with their code of conduct, which they are required to have under the new Act as well, in accordance with their normal process with the employment contracts and their employment laws as well.
Great discussion, and good to highlight that. Now we're into what I call extra time. I notice some people are having to leave us, but there's many still with us, and we do still have probably up to 20 minutes to deal with some more questions if people are happy to hang around. Kathryn.
Oh, there's a few questions that have come through the chat about the time commitment required of a Mayor, and I think that's worth having a bit of a discussion about. Michael asks whether it is a sort of a full-time role, and another person in the chat has suggested that the Mayor needs to have sufficient time in order to do the job. So interested perhaps, Peter, in your thoughts on what the time commitment is, given that you have been a former Mayor.
Yeah, a lot of my colleagues had said, I'm going to be a full-time Mayor. well, sometimes they're sitting around getting, trying to get under the feet of the CEO if they're trying to be full time, and that there isn't all of that work to do. But what I would say is that you need flexibility, because it doesn't all happen 9 to 5, and it doesn't all happen in consecutive days. If you've got a good employer, you might be able to maintain that employment, but to actually to do the role that the community might expect of you, and to do the role that the statutory part of the role, and to do that, to get to all the meetings that you're required to, it takes a hell of a lot of time, and often people who say they're going to be full time, you don't see them after dark, and community groups and organisations, and I'll just go back, and I'm a bit disjointed in what I'm saying, but we go back to the very start, and we talked about the mayor's not just a ceremonial role, no, but it is a ceremonial role in part, and if the community doesn't see the mayor at those particular events that they'd be expected to be at, then it does lose some kudos in the community and some gravitas, if you like. So, yeah, not a full-time job, but you better have a flexible role otherwise, because it can be in and out, in and out, in and out.
I think we need to be very careful on that point, though, because don't we want to attract some good diversity amongst mayors as well? So, that flexibility is critical, but I don't think it means that people that aren't in a full-time employed role can't do it. And I've often heard councillors say, oh, well, they wouldn't be able to do it because they don't have the time, they work full time. I think we've just got to be very careful about that. And the critical thing is, and it's probably a state government issue, that we need to enable people to pick up that role. And so perhaps there should be, as there are in other countries, some mandated, time off when people are elected to that civic responsibility of being a councillor or a mayor from their employer.
I just wanted to acknowledge Nolene's point. I think that there are some opportunities systemically to create opportunities in the sector, and particularly from a diversity perspective, and also recognising that the role and responsibilities of a councillor are quite extensive, and having to read hundreds of papers of council agendas and minutes going into meetings, of course, does require a time commitment. I wondered, Chris, I did note that there's some former immediate past mayors in the room, whether any of those participants might want to contribute their experiences to this conversation. Of course, they don't. Were you looking at anyone in particular there? I was looking at Ross, but I'm not sure. I don't want to put him on the spot. But he may well like to take up the opportunity.
Thanks, Kathryn. Yes, so the question was about the time required, yes?
It was, or in fact, anything else that you might like to contribute from your experience as a mayor to this conversation.
Yes, certainly. It was certainly, I've found the first few months, and obviously then we went into COVID, obviously our world changed greatly as mayor, but I certainly found that walking down the street sometimes, I know one of the other people talked about having a visual presence, and it was about, people sort of say, oh, it's just nice to see the mayor out and about, and also recently times, talking to different community groups as well, and a lot of those community groups, they're all nighttime events or weekend events. So I think Peter mentioned about the flexibility. I certainly see the flexibility is the key, and people who work full time sometimes are very efficient in the way they work as well. So there's certainly no reason why someone full time couldn't take up the position, because a lot of the time they're actually very efficient and work really well with their time.
Yeah, so I guess I've just finished my third term as mayor, and it was a very different term because of COVID-19. And my experience for the previous two as the mayor of a rural council, Mount Alexander, Castlemaine being the major town, was that it was 7 days a week. not all the time, but certainly people wanted you every weekend to attend their function or say a few words. I think I've said so many few words that they just roll out. I think my husband says I'm talking at night. But you know, and they come out genuinely, but they have to come out from the heart. But you get good at being able to express them, and that's what people really find important, I think, in the community. And certainly when COVID hit and our town, like everywhere else, became a ghost town, I found myself going to town almost in contravention of regulations. People were, oh, the mayor's here. It was really important to people to see that. You know, they wanted me to walk up and down the main street and show them it was okay because the mayor was here. So it is a very, that ceremonial, as Peter says, Stephenson says, the ceremonial aspect is very important. And I find it quite strange this year to be removed from that. Certainly the council work has, you know, been different, and there has been community aspects, speaking on social media, etc., the council's Facebook page and putting out stuff like that. But yeah, that's not to be underestimated. You really are the public space of council.
Thanks, Christine, and thank you, Ross. I think they're valuable insights. Kathryn, I wanted to go back to a question that was some way up the chat from someone I know who has left the session, but will be watching it back, because it's been exercising my mind about how to answer this. We've been talking about having selection criteria, position descriptions, perhaps a job interview process for the mayor, etc. From the perspective of a candidate who's not a councillor yet, they're wondering, how can community people promote that sort of rigour to the process if they're not in a position as a councillor to influence it?
I think probably through the council plan process, and the first iteration of the council planning exercise in most councils involves a heightened level of community engagement across a broad range as opposed to specific issues. So I think, you know, the community feedback about what their expectations, not of what only of what the council does, but how the council works together to achieve those goals on behalf of the community, which leads into behaviours, etc., you know, would be fantastic, and probably something that a lot of councils could take on as part of their council planning exercise. It's a good point.
And a good point, Noelene, because governance is usually a key plank of any council plan in some way, shape or form. Kathryn.
And Chris, just on that question, I did note that earlier, and I was pondering that as we've been talking. Of course, the ability for the community to influence the election of the mayor in this particular cycle will be limited, but the opportunities, as Noelene has pointed out, will perhaps be there in across the term in later years. Chris, there's been quite a few questions from the audience around, you know, the role of the CEO, the employment of the CEO, the performance management of the CEO, the difference between, you know, councillor-only meetings and officers and responsibilities. We don't really have time to go into that today. I did want to let everyone know that we are hosting another panel on the 6th of November, where we will go into more detail about the role of the CEO and the governance teams in particular in supporting the incoming councillor groups. So we will be able to go into a little bit more detail about how in regard to those matters. So stay tuned and we'll put up some more information at the end of this session. But Chris, perhaps before we close off, would you like to throw to the audience and ask for final questions?
Absolutely. So yes, we'll throw it up to open Q&A. I know there's a few more questions in the chat, but some of those people might like to ask their questions in person. Who has a question? Bernie, it says Bernie and Fran, but I'm assuming I don't want to assume, but I'm assuming you're Fran.
With the way the COVID has been, and we found ourselves doing Zoom meetings and things like this, is it legislated that we have to have meetings face-to-face after COVID, or can this be something that the councils can actually implement so that we can cater for those councillors that may be away or ill or whatever?
So that might be one for Melissa, because I know the current ability to conduct council meetings virtually is through the COVID omnibus bill, and I think that's been extended. But beyond that, Melissa, are you aware of any moves to make it a permanent possibility?
Look, I know that more broadly there's been a lot of discussion about how many of these provisions that have come in ostensibly temporarily really do need to become permanent fixtures, because as we've all heard it's COVID normal now, and we're not going back to the way we were. So I would be very surprised, to be honest, if we didn't see something more permanent in terms of the ability to hold these meetings virtually.
That of course doesn't preclude councils from having virtual attendance at other sessions such as briefing sessions, etc. It's really the formal business of the council through its proper council meeting that's governed by that legislation, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, yeah, it's certainly already there is that ability, depending on obviously what the meeting it is that you're looking at. But increasingly we're seeing that being used. And again, so frequently, particularly across the legal industry, we're seeing so many just platforms that are being used, and it's becoming a permanent fixture. As I say, I'd be quite surprised if we didn't see that introduced more permanently.
Last call for questions from the audience, as we are going to need to wrap this up. Anyone else with a question for our panel?
In relation to the Mayor, if he finds himself in a situation where he is casting a vote on something that he is very passionate about or has a lot to do with, does the Deputy Mayor step in on that and do the casting vote, or does the Mayor still have the casting vote?
So that's a question that goes to conflict of interest. Peter or Melissa might want to speak a bit more about that, or Noelene for that matter. Peter?
Well, I'll just say briefly, if the Mayor hasn't declared a conflict at the time, then perhaps the Mayor better have a think about it, he or she. And I don't think there's any, I'm not sure if there's a capacity for a deputy to have a casting vote, but when they're chairing the meeting, I guess they do, or do they? Yeah, they do. Okay.
If they're the chair, if they've been installed as the chair of the meeting.
Yeah, they're taking on that role.
Kathryn, any last thoughts? We might go to promoting our next session, which isn't that far away.
Look, I just thought perhaps we ask the panellists for final comments before we do that, Chris.
So Melissa, final thoughts, takeaway message for our audience today.
Look, my final thought is certainly with my Arbiter's hat on, and really encouraging for mayors and indeed councils to take this opportunity at the start, harness the goodwill, the optimism of everybody hopefully that you have in the room, and really talk about how you are going to operate going forward in terms of managing conflict. It's very easy to stand there and go, no, we're going to work together. We understand what this is all about and we're going to make it work. You do need to talk about how you are going to manage conflict, because unfortunately it will arise and it needs to be managed early on. I would encourage you to get in independent experts to help you do that. And address it really early on before it escalates and before it gets so far gone that you've got to call someone like me in.
Peter, your final thoughts and takeaway messages?
Well, I'd like to say congratulations to everybody who's put their hand up, because it is a big commitment, and congratulations to those when you are elected. After that, I'd say if you do want to be mayor, then good luck. You will, and if you become mayor, you will enjoy it. It's a wonderful opportunity, and you will meet some wonderful people. You'll work with some great people. You'll learn a hell of a lot. But don't think you have to be mayor first year either. If you want to just sit back and have a look and see how it unfolds for you, have a go at it later. Don't think that there's only one chance to do it. But most of all, enjoy, and it is about serving your community. So keep that uppermost in your mind. And like Melissa, you won't see me there either.
Thanks, Peter. And Noelene, some final thoughts from you.
Thanks, Chris. Well, I'm now in a role as Chair of Administrators at Casey, where I'm there because things went horribly wrong. And, you know, there's a whole lot of reasons and allegations that are still not concluded as to why things went wrong. But if there are two messages I have for people, one is be clear about what your role is as a councillor and what you're there for, and understand what that means, including in terms of your legislative responsibilities. And the second one is relationships, relationships, relationships. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Noelene. Terrific to have your insights, as well as Peter and Melissa on our panel today. We really appreciate your the preparation you've put into it has been terrific, and your insights for everyone today. Kathryn.
I would like to thank Noelene, Peter and Melissa for your contribution today in this really timely discussion, which of course could have gone on a lot longer. I would like to take the opportunity to also acknowledge Dr. John Lynch, who is in the audience today. John is actually acting Chief Municipal Inspector, and he will be on our panel on Friday, the 6th of November. So welcome, John, and thank you for joining us today. There were a few questions in the chat about councillor induction, and I did just want to let you all know that the VLGA is running councillor induction training, and I think we have booked in numerous sessions across Victoria with a number of councils. So many of you, if you are elected, and I wish you all the best in your election campaign, may well get to go into these things in a lot more detail by participating in those sessions. The VLGA will also be hosting a leadership development program for councillors in very early March, and we'll go into a number of these things in a lot more detail, particularly standards of conduct and code of conduct matters. So Chris, thank you once again for your excellent moderation, and to all of you in the room for your commitment and for taking the time to join us today. Thank you.
We also remind you of the VLGA Connect series of programs that come to you each week with the governance update and a newsroom update. Hopefully you can check those out if you're not aware of them already via YouTube or via podcasts. For that, we will check the chat to see if there's any unanswered questions and do our best to get some resolution to those out through some follow-up material. But we are out of time, and we once again thank our panel. We thank every member of the audience for joining us today, and look forward to seeing you again very soon for another VLGA LGPRo live panel discussion. Good afternoon.